Good morning, brothers and sisters. I take it that the theme for our convention, which is Theosophy in a Changing World, would like to address the question of how the wisdom can be adapted to different periods, different centuries, different eras. Theosophy itself does not change essentially, but how it will be brought into the world will vary according to the conditions of the world and the evolution of humanity. The Theosophical Society has been in existence for 139 years. But in the past more than half a century, our organization has been relatively stagnant, and its membership has been declining since 1928, when it had a peak membership of 45,000 members, as compared to what we have now, which is only 26,000 members. In the meantime, since 1928, the population of the world has increased to 3.5 times. And every year, there are 80 million people who are born every year. If the message of Theosophy reaches, let's say, 100,000 new people every year, then it means that in order to bring the message of Theosophy to these 80 million people for 1 year alone, it will take us 800 years to reach just this increase of population. If we want to reach the increase in population for 2 years, it will take us 1,600 years to reach them. We will see that at such a rate, we as a society will become more and more irrelevant to the changes happening in the world. 130 years ago, the Mahachohan, the teacher of the adepts, exhorted the leaders of the infant Theosophical Society when he said, and I quote, "For our doctrines to practically react on the so-called moral code or the ideas of truthfulness, purity, self-denial, charity, etc., we have to preach and popularize a knowledge of Theosophy." End of quote. We have to ask ourselves, have we achieved such popularization? I'm afraid we have not. The word Theosophy remains a very unfamiliar word or concept to a large majority of the world. Have the Theosophical doctrines reacted practically on society's moral code and influenced the conduct of men and women of the world? Again, we have to answer generally in the negative. It is my impression that a very large percentage of our lodges are oriented towards its internal activities rather than seeking to actively help solve the problems of society. It is incumbent upon us, therefore, that we renew our effort to achieve this vision of the Mahachohan, to make Theosophy and the Theosophical Society a part of the mainstream of human society. To go mainstream means that an idea or practice has become part of the prevailing current in public thought. In other words, most people in the world would somehow be familiar with it or know something about it. Examples of mainstream ideas would be a concept like Zen, or meditation, or reincarnation, or karma. How can we successfully enter the mainstream? I would like to share with you what I consider to be 3 foundations in the effort to go mainstream. And these would involve decades of work, not 1 year, not 5 years, not 10 years. The first foundation, I think, is that there is a need for us to decide what we, the Theosophical Society and Theosophy, would like to be known for. When people hear of Theosophy, what comes to their mind? Is it an Eastern cult? Is it an abstruse philosophy? Is it a psychic group, an educational organization? I guess that 99% of the world who have heard of Theosophy will only know us by one or two or three word associations. For example, it can be esoteric, cult, brotherhood, clairvoyance, Blavatsky, and so on. Those few words will determine whether they will become interested and inquire further about Theosophy or not. If the associated word is a negative one, or an irrelevant one to them, then people will not pursue further the learning of Theosophy. It is important, therefore, that we deliberately determine the keywords for which Theosophy will be known and then popularize it. Will it be, for example, oneness, human family, brotherhood, character building, meditation, a spiritual way of life? What would be like that the world would associate us with? If we do not deliberately introduce or present Theosophy according to the way that it should be known, then there is no other choice but that public opinion will create such impressions or associations even if they are inaccurate or wrong. And wrong impressions will greatly harm the effectiveness of the Theosophical Society. The second foundation is the need to popularize applied Theosophy and establish theosophical practices on a wider scale. In the book, The Letters of the Masters of the Wisdom, Series 2, there is a letter, in fact the last letter of that book, from an adept, a master of the wisdom, wherein each this master said, and I quote, "Theosophy must not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical and has therefore to be disencumbered of useless discussion. It has to find objective expression in an all-embracing code of life thoroughly impregnated by its spirit. Its followers have to set the example of a firmly outlined and a firmly applied morality before they get the right to point out, even in the spirit of kindness, absence of a like ethic unity and singleness of purpose in other associations and individuals." End of quote. I think the message of this statement is very clear. We are being asked that we should not remain on the level of ideas, but we must bring it down and translate it into the issues that face people and society in an applied way in terms of theosophical practices. To make Theosophy relevant, therefore, we must convert theosophical knowledge into enduring practices and institutions that can permeate individual life, family life, schools, politics, society, media, culture, etc. Let us take one example of applied Theosophy, which is theosophical education. It has always been a puzzle to me why the Theosophical Society is not deeply involved in theosophical education. All the theosophical pioneers, whether Blavatsky, Olcott, or Annie Besant, have strongly advocated the founding of theosophical schools. Blavatsky wrote that if we have the money, we would put up theosophical schools, and that the development of the well-rounded human being, the mature human being, can be achieved through a well-designed theosophical school. And yet, this area of applied theosophy, I fear, is one of the most neglected areas of applied theosophy. We must keep in mind the enormous influence that schools can do in molding young minds in the right direction. If we but glance at the Catholic schools in the world, we will see one of the most important secrets of the influence of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the world. There are numerous Catholic orders who run schools, such as the Jesuits, the Lasalite brothers, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and so on. Let's take the Jesuits. Out of about 20,000 Jesuits in the world, there are only 2,400 Jesuits who are involved in education. And yet, these 2,400 Jesuits run 2,129 schools throughout the world with an enrollment of 1.7 million students. Imagine that. Every year, 10 months a year, they are directly molding the future lives of young people. Many of their graduates become leaders in their countries. Let's look at the La Salle brothers. There are 1,693 La Salle brothers who are involved in education. And yet, they have 1,049 schools with almost 1 million students. The Catholic Church itself has more than 200,000 schools, 200,000 schools around the world, enrolling 52 million students. 52 million students. That is more than the combined population of Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. You can imagine the influence of the Catholic Church in countries where it has schools. Why doesn't the TS be intensively involved in education as part of its work on applied theosophy? Why can't it have at least 100 schools by the end of the century? We have the underlying philosophy, we have the methodology, we have the lands, and we have so many educators among our ranks. We can look at many other examples of how applied practice and institutions can help mold the public mind. For example, Zen is really a practice that had been limited to a few full-time monks. But because of their example and the effect on their lives, it has spread and attracted the attention of those who are not monks. And so, for example, in Japan alone, there are more than 3 million people who are practicing Zen meditation, and many millions more around the world who are doing this. And even if the Zen monks are a very small number, and yet their total influence around the world is really tremendous. Another organization comes to my mind, and it is the PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, which was only started in 1980 by 2 persons. But because of its applied advocacy, not just in the level of ideas, but in the level of practice and advocacy, it has done more to make people aware of animal rights and vegetarianism than any organization. It is the most influential animal rights organization in the world today, with an annual budget of $34 million. I wonder if you know that the annual budget of the international TS is only 1% of this budget of this organization. With the deep and noble goals of the TS, why can't we have a budget and a scale of work that will be 100 times what we are doing now? Sometimes we worry that there is not enough money to start these. I think the reality is that we don't have enough worthwhile theosophical projects that will draw the funds that are looking for good projects. It is my impression, having been involved in foundations, that there are many people who have really idle money wanting to put this into good use, and they are searching around the world for worthy projects. Now, the importance of making Theosophy relevant, making it of use to people, is emphasized also by the fact that the average person out there in the world is bombarded by billions of bits of information every day. And if you read a newspaper, let's say a 50-page newspaper, how much would you read in that newspaper? Only those things that interest you and are relevant to you. Other things you'll just skip. If you go to a bookstore and look at the titles of books, it's the same thing. The things that interest you and those which are relevant. Now, interest is something which can be very fickle, because one can be interested in the personal lives of celebrities, and that would not be of much value. But relevance is something else. When something is relevant to human problems, human situation, then people will tend to be interested in those things. What are the issues in human life? This would be things like human sorrow, relationship, wars, crimes. Is there something that we have to offer along these lines? We have. Now, unless we demonstrate that these ideas, the theosophical ideas, can be applied in daily life, then we can hardly enter the consciousness of the average person, because people are so absorbed with millions of other things that they don't have time to try to sort out which ones are really worthwhile and which ones are not. So for Theosophy to become part of the mainstream, we need to become relevant to the daily life of the individual, and the range of possible theosophical practices and institutions is almost limitless. It can be as simple as a center for stress management. This, for example, one example of this is what a famous American doctor did, Kabat-Zinn. Just using the idea or the practice of mindfulness, he has developed a very widely effective and recognized way of handling stress in human life, just from mindfulness. So it can be as simple as a center for stress management, or it can go deeper into meditation or yoga or well-being. It can be on marital harmony, parenting, education, the establishment of schools, vegetarianism, health and fitness, animal welfare, ecology, organic agriculture, energy conservation, compassionate entrepreneurship, leadership, politics, youth development, social development, and so on. It is best that if we do this, because we are so spread out throughout the world, it is best that the different theosophical groups with similar advocacies and projects should coordinate with each other in order to develop synergy. Otherwise, there will be a tendency for individual projects to just fade and die a natural death because of lack of support. If the TS itself does not pioneer the application of its tenets and principles, then it will remain as an intellectual philosophy that will have little relevance to the problems of the world. The third foundation I'd like to share with you is the need to train qualified advocates of Theosophy and applied Theosophy. This is a prerequisite to the other two. Before Theosophy can be popularized, there must be people who would be ready to explain them to the world. This is absolutely essential, because if we do not have qualified people to explain what Theosophy is and how it's being applied, then even if we become popular, then such popularity will just backfire, and we will become notorious instead of being popular. For this reason, it is essential for the international TS and the most active sections of the world to undertake a concerted and integrated program of training theosophical workers on 3 areas. The first area is on Theosophy and the ageless wisdom itself, but linked to modern insights, let's say in psychology, as well as in science and other fields. Second, they must be familiar with theosophical practice, applied theosophy, because this is the area that will enable the advocate to bridge the gap between ideas and daily life. And the third is communication skills. Such an advocate must possess a minimum level of communication ability, spoken or written, plus, of course, prudence. This effort to develop a growing core of advocates must be done on an international scale, because many sections do not have the trainers or the experience in conducting such training. The international headquarters and the strong sections must help the less active theosophical groups. But we must not forget that such a training should not limit itself to theoretical topics, but must include the applied side of theosophical knowledge. Ideas alone cannot change the world. It is the application of these ideas that will change the world. So these then are three important foundations for mainstreaming theosophy and bringing theosophy to the world and to the common people. The first is that we must be clear as to how we'd like to be known to the world. Even if they hear only 1, 2, or 3 words about theosophy, it should be the right association, keywords. The second is to establish on a wide scale enduring practices and institutions that will make theosophical wisdom relevant to the lives of people and society. And the third is to intensively train a large core of theosophical advocates who will become the ambassadors of the wisdom to the world. These programs, especially the second and the third one, may take 30 or 50 years to accomplish before we can even see their real fruits. But they are the solid foundation upon which we can build the popularization of theosophy and making theosophy a cornerstone of future religions and civilization, as hinted by the Mahachohan himself. There will be many difficulties and obstacles in attaining such visions, but we must remember that such visions were not just conceived by ordinary mortals like us. The theosophical ship was launched by no less than several masters of the wisdom, and its agenda is no less than the transformation of entire masses of people and societies. Are we failing the inner founders of the Theosophical Society by being too timid about difficult programs? We need to take risks. When the idea is right, there is no failure, only temporary setbacks. In today's gathering, permit me to invite all the delegates to think about this and see what we can jointly do in pursuing these, no matter how humble is our beginning. Let us join hands and demonstrate to the world that this thing called theosophy holds the key to the long-term solutions of the problems of the world. And brothers and sisters, let us start today.